So everybody is now waiting for the opportunity to raise all your questions. And I try to keep it really short here in order to offer also you the possibility to come across with all the things you wanted to know about. Now, if technology is working, we can move on. All right. I'm going to answer first now the questions why indices are so important. And I'm going to start from an even broader point of view. Europe is currently facing the Japanese disease, which is ultimately we have an overaging society and no growth. Now, indices are not curing all the evils, but at least we are contributing. Index investments are a much better way to save for retirements. That is something everybody should keep in mind when you ultimately discuss about indices in general. And I just brought along with me here a couple of statistics. About 60 to 90%, and there are many different studies existing, of active funds investing do not beat their benchmarks. So the bulk majority is ultimately poorer compared to the index, and they ultimately do that with about 5 times the costs. So it's really ultimately, you should do index investments if you want to save for retirement. Indices are also a fast-growing area in our financial markets here. If you compare ultimately the active investment industry, a kind of shrinking part of the financial services industry in general, they have a growth which is by only half of the growth ultimately the passive investment industry does have. Indices contribute to this area. Indices are really a kind of growth area and ideally should not be strangled. Now, indices also ensure a certain efficient capital deployment in general on a global basis. And last but not least, indices always had been the basis for transparency, for transparent investments. That was the basis when ultimately Charles Dow, at some point in time, 100 years ago, had invented the first indices just for that reason, to really create transparency. Now, what I'm going to say next is most likely something you are not necessarily going to expect from an indexer here. But I do need to make a very brief disclaimer in the beginning before all the journalists running out of the room here with the headline that the index industry is asking for regulation. There are a couple of good reasons why indices should be regulated. There had been indices, and we have heard that a little bit early on already, there are indices which are facing inherent conflicts of interests. Those conflicts of interests are the basis for manipulations, for misconduct, as we have seen it in the marketplace. It's not only that those indices are facing no trust anymore, it's also that the entire index industry, to a certain extent, had been exposed to less trust, to less confidence. That must be restored, and that is why those indices who are exposed to conflicts of interest, which are leading to potential misconduct, should be definitely regulated. We have learned ultimately that the discussion about regulation now ultimately had advanced a little bit, and ultimately that there is a wider range of indices now also being considered to be part of the regulation. However, if we are looking to the current discussions, we do have certain issues where we believe that the potential proposals on the table, the various discussions, are going a little bit too far. It has been mentioned already early on, not all of the 2 million plus indices we currently do see in the marketplace are equal. Indices based on regulated data should definitely be treated very differently. There is an index being based on regulated data created on an exchange in a very transparent and regulated way, calculated by a transparent methodology. That animal is very different compared to a panel-based subjective index where data are pulled from a limited number of market participants. Critical benchmarks, in our point of view, should be exactly those indices who are prone to manipulation. Those are the ones who had been mentioned earlier on, the IBORs, which had been manipulated also in the past couple of years. And we do understand that that was also to a certain extent the initial focus of the proposal. Now certain of the discussions had advanced, and now there is a certain tendency of various parties in the marketplace to put more and more into that category of the critical indices, and ultimately to a certain extent also to limit flexibility of index providers to provide their indices. And hopefully you remember that I tried to start my brief comments here with making you understand that indices do good things for the market in general. Now, the index industry in the past was an industry ultimately which was living on a level playing field. There had been a global competition amongst all the index providers. And Alain nicely pointed out that also MSCI is providing certain indices for the European marketplace. We love that competition. And we do not want to change the competition by regulating parts of the market and leaving other parts ultimately out of the market. Regulatory arbitrage is something you should avoid. It's not only that you ultimately should avoid, to a certain extent, regulatory arbitrage, you also ideally should not change a functioning market. The functioning market of the index providers live on the basis that we are able to provide indices and that we are also getting compensated by the ones who are using our indices. Discussing about improving public transportation is definitely something which is very worthwhile to do. Coming up with ideas how to do that is worthwhile as well. Thinking about ultimately making public transportation for free is not a part of that discussion. And it's very similar here ultimately also for the index industry. We deliver something for the financial markets. We have done so also for the past decades. We have ultimately not been affected by any manipulations for our equity indices in the past. And there is a good reason why we also get compensated by all the different market participants, because they like what we do. Now, in summary, we are very much advocating here towards a calibrated approach towards regulation. We are advocating towards an approach which ultimately takes into consideration that indices based on regulated data are treated differently. We would very much like to see a regulation which is not going to change competition on a global level, and we also, of course, would like to have a regulation which is not going to affect our business model. Thank you very much.